Essentially, what they're trying to do is basically intimidate the Ukrainian government, to tell them, look, you really don't want to push us too far. We are crazy enough that if need be, we will actually unleash our forces on you.
Hello, this is Stephen Edginton from The Sun, and today I'm interviewing Mark Galeotti. Mark Galeotti is an author, lecturer, and analyst who specializes in geopolitics and Russia. We're going to be talking all about Putin's buildup of forces on the Russia-Ukraine border. Will this lead to war, or is this simply sabre-rattling from the Kremlin? What is currently happening on the Russia-Ukraine border?
Well, we know the facts, we don't know the intention. I mean, the Russians are building up their forces at really quite a substantial rate. The Ukrainians say there's an extra 80,000 troops. That's a little bit more questionable. The Americans are putting the figure closer to 25,000. But nonetheless, this is a very substantial amount of heavy metal, tanks and artillery being moved close to the Ukrainian border. And what we don't know is whether this is an attempt to intimidate the Ukrainians or whether it's the prelude for some more aggressive military action.
And what could be some of the explanations behind Russia's mobilization of troops? What are the motives behind this?
Well, if we pull back, I mean, what is it the Russians really want? The Russians basically think that Ukraine is part of their sphere of influence. It's not that they want to invade it and conquer it. I mean, they took a small part of it, Crimea, but that was because it's a part that every Russian thought was genuinely Russian. But the rest, all they want to do, well, I say all, what they want to do is to basically get the Ukrainians to accept that their attempts to join the European Union, and certainly their attempts to join NATO, should not be allowed to continue. They really don't like the idea of potentially NATO coming all the way up to the Russian border there. So essentially what they're trying to do is basically intimidate the Kiev, the Ukrainian government, to tell them, look, you really don't want to push us too far. We are crazy enough that if need be, we will actually unleash our forces on you. So it's better that you make some kind of political deal with us.
And if we look at some of the outcomes of this mobilization, can you just take us through some of the scenarios that could happen? For example, could this lead to some kind of small conflict, large conflict? Could this lead to, what kind of, you said that this could be a sort of attempt to bully Ukraine into, going more into Moscow's sphere of influence. What kind of outcomes could happen in this scenario?
Well, let's start with the relative nightmare scenarios, the worst cases. Well, first of all, Crimea now has something of a problem with water supplies, because when the Russians seized it in 2014, what happened is 85% of Crimea's water, fresh water, comes from something called the North Crimean Canal, which leads further into Ukraine. And so what the Ukrainians did is they blocked it. So actually, there's a real problem in Crimea in terms of just simply, in many of the main cities, for example, you only have drinking water for a few hours a day, that kind of thing. So one of the things the Russians could do is launch a major offensive precisely to seize that canal in order to guarantee Crimea's water supplies. A second possibility is, again, a major offensive to connect Crimea with mainland Russia. In other words, to basically drive along the coastline, because the Crimean Peninsula is actually separate from Russia. The Russians have built a bridge, but what they could do is also form a land bridge, which would mean taking a couple of substantial cities and so forth, and which again means a lot of proper fighting. And the third kind of major offensive operation is they might decide that they don't want to take any more territory, but they want to basically give the Ukrainians a good hammering to remind them that their military is not up to Russia's standards. So what they could do is target places where there are substantial concentrations of Ukrainian troops and launch massive attacks there, and then pull back to their existing sort of area of control. So that's the worst case. We don't yet see the kind of forces in theatre which would be enough for these kind of operations. But the point is, more are coming every day, and we don't know how far they're going to continue. More likely is what we're going to see is that, there is already a low-level civil war of sorts going on. There is this region of Ukraine, the Donbass, which is held by two, they call themselves the People's Republics, which are kind of Russian puppet states that just declared themselves independent. Well, pretty much every day there is fighting on that border. Some skirmishes, some sniper fire, low-level stuff, but resulting in deaths. Could well be that we're going to see a massive upsurge in that kind of sort of fighting, particularly artillery attacks, because that's where the Russians have a real strength. Or it could just simply be sabre-rattling and I mean, the Russians have called this, oh, just military exercises, nothing to see here. And it could be in a couple of weeks' time, they'll all go back to barracks, with the Russians having just simply made the point. We can move troops very quickly. We could be back here anytime. Because if we compare the Russians with NATO, let's be honest, with NATO, on the whole, obviously there are special forces who can move very fast. But generally speaking, for NATO, rapid deployment means we'll be there at the end of the month. For the Russians, rapid deployment means you're rolling out of your barracks at the end of this day. So it could well be that all they want to do is just make that point is we could be back anytime. So this is the problem we've got with dealing with it. It could be, it could be anything from a full war to just simply a show of force. And the Kremlin's saying that there's nothing to see, but the point is we can't believe them, unfortunately. So we're still left at this point of not quite knowing where this can go.
So when we compare this situation to previous conflicts that Russia has initiated, whether it was in Crimea or Georgia or other places, before those conflicts, did we see a similar kind of buildup of troops, a similar kind of mobilization? And I think one of the things that experts have commented on this situation now is Russia have been so blasé about it. They haven't exactly hidden what's going on. So can you compare this to some of the previous sort of, pre-conflicts that Russia has enacted?
Well, it's certainly true that there are key differences. I mean, the Russians tend to use military exercises as a pretext for assembling their troops before military attacks. We saw that, for example, with the Georgian War back in 2008. This time, absolutely, they've made no real attempts at being sort of at all covert about it. Unlike, for example, Crimea in 2014, which is a very much a sort of snap operation, people not having their national insignia on their arms. So everyone was wondering, well, are these mercenaries or what, that kind of thing. But again, this is a problem. You can either play it as proof that this is something different, that this is just simply showing the flag rather than anything else, or the Russians think very carefully about what they call maskirovka, which is military deception. Or it could be precisely they're doing it so overtly so that we assume it's not anything really going on. But yes, I mean, I think the fact that we've seen all kinds of stuff on Russian social media, people who just simply, filming railway wagons going past their town loaded up with tanks and so forth, and no one's made any attempt to try and get these yanked off social media or anything. It does imply that the Russians are very, very aware that they're busy making a spectacle of just how much military material and troops they're bringing into the border area.
Let's compare this to Ukraine back in 2014, when obviously, you mentioned the annexation of Crimea. How does this compare? Can you talk about the state of the Ukrainian army, for example? Can you talk about the state of the Russian army? Can you talk about opinion in Russia, opinion in Ukraine? How does this whole situation compare back to 2014?
It's good. It's a good question, because precisely it's a world apart from 2014. In 2014, what had happened is the Ukrainians, there'd just been a fairly broad popular rising against a pretty unpopular and deeply corrupt government led by a man by the name of President Yanukovych. And the particular spark of that was that originally he'd agreed that Ukraine would get closer to the European Union on economic ties. Then when Moscow leaned on him, he actually made a U-turn and said, oh, actually, no, we're not going to be signing that deal. But that was just the spark. It wasn't the real reason. It was just basically this was a very unpopular government. And there was this rising, basically, the Yanukovych regime mishandled it dramatically and fell. And then there was chaos, and no one really knew what was going to come after that. And at that point, the Russians got very worried about Crimea, because Crimea, ever since the 1950s, it's been part of Ukraine, even back in Soviet times. But historically, it was seen actually as Russian territory. It has the key bases for the Black Sea Fleet, one of the key Russian fleets. And a lot of people who live in Crimea are actually Russian-speaking, Russian passport holders. You have a lot of, for example, naval officers and their families who, when they retired from the Black Sea Fleet, thought, oh, Crimea, it's a very nice climate and so forth, we'll live here. So there was this little slice of territory that Russians thought was Russian. and which had a key Russian series of naval and air bases, which might fall to this new regime that, from the sound of it, was going to go really sort of pro-Western. And that's when Putin decided, okay, we're going to have to do something about this. And it helped that basically the Ukrainian state had all but collapsed. So, I mean, the actual operation to seize Crimea, we've got to accept, was a textbook success, with almost no bloodshed. The Russians special forces rolled out, basically locked down the peninsula. They used local kind of thugs as local self-defense forces, really just to give them a bit of deniability. But this was a Russian special forces operation. The Ukrainian forces there didn't fight. A lot of them actually just simply defected to the Russians. And it was massively popular. I was living in Moscow for most of 2014. And for example, I mean, the night that the sort of annexation was formally recognized, I scarcely got a wink of sleep, because all night people were just driving around all the main streets of Moscow, blowing their horns, waving Russian flags and such. It was real public enthusiasm. So back in 2014, there was this small peninsula that was actually, frankly, already keen on joining Russia. The Ukrainian armed forces had basically collapsed. And Russia already had a lot of its best troops, naval infantry, Marines, and special forces, Spetsnaz, already in Crimea, ready to roll. So that was a perfect situation. Now, though, the Ukrainian military has improved dramatically. I mean, unfortunately, much of the Ukrainian state has not reformed properly, but the military has. They've got 250,000 men and women under arms. And although they're not to the same qualitative level as the Russians, nonetheless, you know, in any kind of major conflict, they would give the Russians a bit of a bloody nose, even if they ultimately would go down, but they would go down fighting. Secondly, look, every Russian, or pretty much every Russian, even opposition figures like Alexei Navalny, the guy whom Putin had poisoned, basically believed that Crimea was Russian. The Donbass, the current dispute over southeastern Ukraine, Russians don't really care about. They certainly don't want to see their boys dying there, and they don't want to see money spent there. So actually, the Russian government pretends to its own people that it's not really involved. And so if the Russians did roll in this time, they would probably win because they've got artillery and air power and higher tech and probably better training. But they would take losses. There'd be more Russian boys coming home in zinc boxes. And it would not be popular at a time when this September we've got parliamentary elections coming up in Russia. And although elections in Russia are rigged, the Kremlin wants, in a way, to have to rig them as little as possible. So it really doesn't want to have a massive public outcry against it. So I think for all these reasons, common sense says there will not be a war. The problem is we don't really know what Putin thinks. We don't really know how the world looks from his point of view. Me, I don't think it will make sense for Russia. He might have a different opinion.
One of the sort of elephants in the room in that fantastic explanation was the West and the US and NATO. How has that changed since 2014? Obviously, we didn't really see any intervention back then. We had President Obama, now we've got Joe Biden. How has the West's response to Ukraine, how has the Ukrainian government's sort of relationship with the West changed since that chaotic period in 2014?
I mean, in some ways, it hasn't. I mean, it's worth noting that when this crisis blew up, the Americans said, oh, we're going to send some warships into the Black Sea next to the sort of conflict area, just to sort of show that we're serious. Well, they just announced that actually they won't after all. The bottom line is this: no one in the West, no one in NATO wants to go to war for Ukraine, and certainly not a war with Russia. Now, the Ukrainian government says we want to join NATO because that's the only way we can feel secure with this big bad Russia as our neighbor. And NATO's really stuck because they can't be honest. They can't be honest and say, actually, we'd rather not, thanks very much. So they have to make nice noises and so forth. But the point is, anyway, I mean, militarily, politically, you know, Ukraine is not ready for NATO membership and won't be for years. So it's really just a question of whether or not you string them along or not.
What do you mean by that? That they won't be
well,
ready?
First of all, there's a lot of kind of technical stuff. Is if you're going to be in NATO, your troops have to be at a certain level. your troops have to be able to have what they call interoperability. In other words, that basically NATO troops have to be able to work together, because usually they're going to be operating in like kind of combined forces where you'll have, you know, Italians and Germans and Brits together, as we saw, for example, in Afghanistan. Ukrainian forces, they're just not at this kind of level in which they could. I mean, even nuts and bolts things like the guns they have are still old Soviet era guns, which has a totally different type of ammunition from NATO ones. So if you're going to have, you know, Ukrainian forces there, you have a totally different set of kit, all that kind of thing. So that's the technical stuff. That ultimately, I mean, as long as you just spend enough money, you can fix that. Then there's the political stuff that actually, at the moment, I mean, on the whole, NATO's rules are that if you are a country which is in a current dispute with another country, you can't be a member, because they don't want it in a way to be sort of coming in straight into a war, because a key element of NATO is the idea of what's called its Article 5 guarantee, which is if you attack any NATO member country, it's treated as if you're attacking all NATO member countries. So if a country is already at war, how does that work? So either they'd have to change NATO's rules, or Ukraine would have to anyway have made a deal with Russia to settle its disputes. So for all these reasons, you know, we're talking, even if we give what's called a membership action plan for Ukraine, we're talking maybe 10 years down the line. In part, Ukraine pushes hard on this because it's a way of guilt tripping us, because they know that we are not going to say, yes, sure, come in, join the club. And instead, we feel bad and we give them assistance, and we overlook the fact that there's still massive levels of corruption in the country and that kind of thing. But also the trouble is, it scares the bejesus out of the Kremlin. You know, you've got to understand this kind of people like Putin and his generation. You know, he's 68. He is of that kind of Homo Sovieticus, Soviet era generation who got used to the idea of superpower status and that the West was this fearful enemy. And although it's paranoid nonsense, they genuinely believe that the West is out to get Russia, that the West wants to marginalize Russia and maybe even break the Russian Federation apart. When Ukrainians rose up against their government in 2013, 2014, you know, I obviously spent a lot of time speaking to Russians within the sort of security and foreign policy realm. And the number of them who absolutely flatly believe that that was an operation that was run by the CIA and MI6, rather than being a genuine popular movement against a corrupt government, is really, really striking. And so as far as they're concerned, every time the Ukrainians talk about joining NATO, they're thinking, you see, this was what it's all about. It's about the West trying to basically steal Ukraine from us. So this is really about politics and perception. You know, Ukraine's not going to be a member of NATO for a long time. NATO doesn't want to get into any fighting, but the Ukrainians are going to keep talking about NATO. And every time they do, that makes Moscow all the more convinced that they have to basically do something to change the political situation on the ground.
I'd be interested to talk a bit further in more detail about some of these misconceptions on both sides in terms of, you know, what they think each other's goals are and what the outcomes will be. Let's stick on this issue, though, of how the West should respond specifically to Russia's mobilization now. I'm going to quote you from an article in The Spectator. You said, after 7 years of responding to Russian adventurism after the event, in the hope of deterring the next, maybe it's worth trying something different. After all, a package of measures ready to be enacted in case of significant Russian escalation is not just of use this spring, it could have a lasting effect. What could this package of measures look like?
Well, first of all, it shouldn't look like the usual one, which is just basically we pick a random bunch of rich Russians and officials and say they can't come to the West and any assets they have here are frozen, because that bothers them, but it doesn't bother Putin. Putin doesn't have assets in the West that he has to worry about. No, instead, it should be a kind of, I think, a range of things. First of all, kind of classic economic sanctions on Russia, which could mean, for example, there is this gas pipeline that's being built, very controversial gas pipeline being built to connect Russia with Germany, Nord Stream 2. Well, we could actually say, okay, well, that's going to be frozen or stopped. We could talk about, again, it goes into sort of economic statecraft wonkery in terms of preventing Western banks from dealing with Russian sovereign debt, which is basically the sort of the debt that the Russian state central bank itself kind of collects, which would have an economic impact. We also could look at more means to basically sanction the extent to which the Russian defense-related sector is able to raise money and buy spare parts and everything else in the West, things like that. So there's economic measures as well. However, we should also be thinking, I think, more imaginatively. Again, we tend to be really traditional and really predictable in how we act. And the Russians game plan this. They think, well, what do we think is going to be the outcome? We should therefore be thinking about ways specifically of surprising the Russians. And that might be saying things like, well, okay, if you do anything against Ukraine, not only are we going to provide military assistance to Ukraine, not soldiers, but high-tech weapons that'll blow Russian tanks away and that kind of thing. But also, we will think about other areas that matter to you. Belarus, the dictatorship of Belarus is currently more or less fighting kind of a political war with its own population and with Russian assistance and backing. Maybe we're actually going to start saying, well, we can get much tougher on Belarus. Georgia, where the Russians have launched a military attack, maybe what we'll say is, okay, if you do that, we're going to give 10 million euros to support Georgian counterintelligence operations. Generally, the Russians, it's a bit of a cliche to think of them as chess players, particularly because Putin doesn't really play chess. But, broadly speaking, the Russians, like any good chess player, looks at the whole board. So in other words, if it's getting attacked on one side, maybe it'll think about, well, okay, I'll move on the other side of the board. We tend to be very, very much more limited in how we look. So we need to be thinking about the whole board. And in some ways, the exact details of that package doesn't matter so much as it has to be agreed by not everyone in the European Union or NATO, because that will take forever. As long as you've got Britain, America, France, and Germany on board, that's really what matters. And the key thing is, and as I said, we need to be communicating this, get this package done beforehand. Once the fighting starts, it's really hard to get anyone to back down. So this time, let's get it in beforehand and say, look, we don't know what you're planning. If you are planning a major military escalation, I'm not talking about a bit more shelling across the line of contact, but the real offensive, be aware this is what you're going to face. And I also said in that as well, that article as well, we need to be doing this quietly. We have a tendency to have a bit of megaphone diplomacy. And the trouble is, for people like Putin, that looks like a kind of a challenge to his machismo, and therefore he feels he has to respond. So this is why we just need to kind of have someone speak to him quietly, say, look, you are still free to basically move your troops away and just simply say, we told you it was just an exercise. You don't have to have any kind of embarrassing climb downs, but we want you to precisely de-escalate the situation now.
Let's look at some of the issues perhaps that the West faces in terms of its response. And, that's a very interesting proposal, but I'm sure let's drill down on some of the details of it. You talked about the United States, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom all agreeing to sort of a much tougher stance economically, politically, and even in practical terms, in terms of helping, opposition parties, etc., in various different countries, which might be more aggressive towards Russia, for example. So Germany, that's an interesting example. You talked about the Nord Stream pipeline. The German government seemed pretty reluctant to stop this from happening. Most of the pipeline's been built. There's a lot of economic pressure in Germany to keep it open. Isn't the problem that you have with that solution that all of these different, these four countries, it's not going to be quite as easy as one would hope for those four countries to agree on this set of, tough, let's call them sanctions against Russia, and can you specifically look at that country, Germany, and talk about the relationship they have with Russia and how that's changing?
No, I mean, you're absolutely right that it's as a political challenge, it's a nightmare to try and get an agreement between just those four countries, let alone anything wider. But if one looks at Germany, again, I mean, the thing about this Nord Stream 2 pipeline is, in some ways, it too has become an issue of political machismo, because basically it's been the Americans who've been pushing for blocking this pipeline. And they've more or less been just telling the Germans what to do. And, Germany is increasingly aware that it is essentially the dominant power now on continental Europe. And I think there's an element in which they're thinking, no, we are not going to be told by Washington what to do, especially because there is deep suspicion that part of the reason why Washington is so keen on blocking this pipeline is because actually it wants to sell American liquefied natural gas instead. So, as far as the Germans are concerned, look, this is just about commercial interest or whatever. The thing is, in a way, the potential beauty of this approach is, look, if the Russians do launch a major offensive, probably even however reluctant they are, the Germans will have to do something about Nord Stream 2. Because basically, we are going to be seeing scenes of, cities under shell fire, of refugees fleeing from the war zone, of dead babies being pulled out of rubble, all these kind of, really, terrifying scenes. And in those situations, I think even Berlin, however reluctant, would feel it just can't continue saying, yes, that's terrible. By the way, guys, keep finishing that last 5% of the pipeline. By actually forestalling any kind of conflict, it means that Germany doesn't have to carry out those sanctions. Remember, these are just threats. And therefore, if these threats work, and if these threats are able to just tip the balance in Moscow away from any kind of intervention, it means that Nord Stream 2 can continue. And all these various German companies, which are busy lobbying behind the scenes to keep trade ties with Russia, they win out. I think, again, it seems perverse, but actually by threatening action, you're less likely to have to actually take that action.
Now, Nord Stream 2 is one example. Does this point to a wider split between European foreign policy goals and the United States? I know I've talked, a lot about this with other interviewees in terms of the effect of Donald Trump on the relationship between the United States and Europe. But I think it goes wider than that in terms of European nations don't want to be seen to be taking orders from Washington anymore. I think they want to be seen as their own kind of superpower in their own right. So does this point to wider splits between the US and Europe, and what could be the outcome of that?
Yeah, it splits. I mean, there's both splits within Europe and also this Euro-Atlantic challenge. I mean, the thing is, Biden has talked a lot about wanting to re-establish relations with the West, with Europe, rekindle alliances and such like. And I'm sure he genuinely believes it. But also, if we're realistic, from America's point of view, it's still dealing with this very, very serious coronavirus challenge of its own. And increasingly, China is what really bothers it. I mean, China is a real, not just an antagonist, but actually a genuine rival in a way that Russia is not and will not be. And so I think there is an element in which, there's this kind of jargon phrase, bandwidth. We always talk about bandwidth in politics these days. But certainly there is an extent to which actually Washington is just too busy looking east to be excessively bothered with Europe. And yes, also, we've got some really quite two-dimensional perspectives of Russia in Washington still, which is very much a legacy of the Trump era, where, basically when people were talking about Russia, they were really talking about Donald Trump and whether or not they were in favor of him or not. So you've got some people in DC who basically regard Russia as Mordor from Lord of the Rings, the source of all evil, and therefore who absolutely want to see a really sort of hard line being taken. And at the same time, there's these European countries that are saying, well, hang on, we are, first of all, a damn sight closer to Russia. Secondly, a lot of us have a lot of trade connections with Russia. And thirdly, we actually have a rather more nuanced understanding. Yes, this is the Putin regime is an unpleasant, kleptocratic, authoritarian regime, but we still feel we can find ways of dealing with it. So yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the problems, that America doesn't seem to have realized that, especially, but not solely because of the Trump era, it can't give orders. But last thing to throw in there, what I find really interesting is that Moscow doesn't seem to understand that either. They still often see European countries as just basically America's proxies. When, for example, Poland and Lithuania have been very, very strong about pushing the idea of Ukraine becoming part of NATO. And that's really because of Pole and Lithuanian attitudes towards Russia. But if you look at some of the commentary in the Russian press, it's very much, you see the American allies like Poland have started this process, and they see it all as part of some kind of grand plan. So both of the old superpower capitals, Moscow and Washington, still, I think, don't really fully take on board the extent to which, yes, Europe is not in any way a coherent or effective geopolitical actor, but on the other hand, it's certainly not willing to just simply be divided between the two of them.
Let's talk about Vladimir Putin. Now, he is an absolutely fascinating man. I think you've written a book about him, if not several books, at least relating to him. How much does this come down to the man Putin? How much does the relationship between the West, the United States, all of these conflicts, how much do they come down to one man, Vladimir Putin?
I mean, it'd be very tempting to talk about Putin. In fact, I should mention my book is called We Need to Talk About Putin. But if we're honest, I mean, he's not the single crucial figure. In many ways, he is more a representative of his political generation. As I mentioned, this is the political generation who didn't just grow up in Soviet times, but they had their early careers in Soviet times. They thought they knew the way the world was going. They were the citizens of one of the two great superpowers of the world and so forth. And then literally, last day of 1991, at the stroke of a pen, their country was just wiped out of existence. And they are now parts of, citizens of the Russian Federation, which in the 1990s was in an absolutely catastrophic state. It was a time when a handful of people, so-called oligarchs, were making huge amounts of money, basically by privatizing state interests into their own pockets, usually through corrupt deals. Whereas most Russians were living a desperate hand-to-mouth existence. And there's this sense of, where did it all go? What happened to our status in the world? And after a certain point, that becomes anger. Who took it from us? So I think, Putin, yes, I mean, obviously he matters as a person, but you've got to realize he's not, well, I personally don't think he's that smart. He clearly has considerable political cunning, but he doesn't really have much experience in the world outside. He was in the KGB, and although that's been built up to sort of some notion that he was some kind of master spy, he wasn't. He was a sort of a solid B minus guy, if one looks at his service records. He wasn't out there being a Soviet James Bond. He was basically dealing with paperwork in East Germany. So this is not a guy who really understands the world that well. He's very much reliant on the people around him. And that's where the problem lies. Because when he first started as president, the people around him had a whole variety of different opinions. There were some who were relatively liberal, some who wanted to see better relations with the West, others who were more hawkish. But the point is, there was debate. Over time, like so many authoritarian leaders, in some ways, he's become a caricature of himself. But also his circle has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And now he's basically surrounded largely by yes men and people who are every bit as hawkish and paranoid as him. And they're from his own generation generally. And I think this is the problem. So in some ways, basically Putin is just simply acting on the world, the picture of the world that people paint for him. And they come and tell him, Vladimir Vladimirovich, this is what the Americans have done now. This is what's going on. And so he responds to that. But actually, the picture they paint is already a very, very biased one. So yeah, it matters. But I think it's more that he is the representation of his generation. And this is one reason why I'm kind of unfashionably optimistic about Russia, because his generation, he's 68. He can stay in power for a lot longer because of new constitutional changes that have been brought in. But generally speaking, his generation is on the out.
That's fascinating. I want to talk about Alexei Navalny as well slightly later on, but we'll just stick with Putin for now. What do you think his goals are, and how from that explanation, you make Putin sound quite reactive in a way. This is what America is doing, we must respond. How reactive is he versus being sort of proactive on the world stage, and what are his ultimate goals for Russia?
I mean, his ultimate goals for Russia are essentially, coin a phrase, make Russia great again. And I think particularly he's at that stage in his career where he's clearly thinking about his historic legacy. Apparently this is a question that he often asks when he meets historians and so forth. In 100 years' time, how will they be writing about me? Which is obviously, when we're talking about a person who has his enemies killed, it's a very uncomfortable question to be asked. I think he's thinking about that. And so, what he's thinking was he believes that Russia deserves to be a great power. Not because it's a member of the UN Security Council or because it has a nuclear arsenal or whatever, but because it's Russia, and that Russia is a naturally great power, and that Russia essentially saved the world from Nazism in the Second World War and so forth. The thing is, though, his idea of what is a great power is a very old-fashioned one. It's not about sort of global Britain and soft power and interconnectedness and so forth. It's about a great power is like any empire. It's got a sphere of influence, countries that basically are under its control. And that's where Ukraine comes in. A great power basically has to be involved in the resolution of any major global issues. And so this is one of the things, like, for example, why the Russians went into Syria. It was that sense of, oh, no. You don't get to work out what's going to happen on Syria without having to consider our interests too. So basically, Russia has to be there. And thirdly, a great power gets to kind of break the international rules from time to time and get away with it. And the thing is, he feels that this is what America's got. And what America's got, Russia has to have. And because we don't recognize that, we don't say, yeah, sure, Ukraine, Georgia, and so forth, yeah, you can have those, no problem. He sees us as, in a way, trying to deny Russia his great strength. I don't want to defend him in any way. I mean, he is an unpleasant man who has brought about a lot of unpleasant policies. But what I would say is, in his mind, he is defending Russia. He feels that, in a way, he's having to respond to all these attacks. When we complain about the fact that some journalist or opposition activist in Russia has been imprisoned or indeed poisoned, he doesn't see that as us standing up for our values. He sees that as us trying to interfere in Russian politics. So I think this is one of the key problems, that there is a real lack of a meeting of minds. Russia or Putin sees the world in different ways. And so, look, I don't think he has a grand strategy. I mentioned that he's not a chess player, even though that's one of the kind of classic kind of cliches of Russians. You've got to remember, I mean, what is his real sport? It's judo. And when you go into the ring in judo, you have a sense of your opponent, maybe your opponent's signature moves and how you'll respond. But basically speaking, you go into the ring, you circle your opponent looking for an opportunity. And when you see that opportunity, you can't sit there and just contemplate the pros and cons of acting. You have to move fast. That's really, I think, encapsulates how Putin works. He's constantly, and his state is constantly looking for opportunities. Look, they're aware how weak Russia is. The Russian army has been modernized dramatically, but still, Russia has fewer troops than European NATO. The Russian economy, again, you can't really use this comparison that well, but nonetheless, gross domestic product, the best measure of economy, it's about the size of Italy's. But nonetheless, you're trying to be a global power. So, you basically have to take what opportunities you can. And so, whether it's spreading some disinformation here, whether it's supporting some kind of radical and populist and divisive political movements there, whether it's moving into trying to inject yourself into a civil war, or indeed leaning on Ukraine, you take whatever opportunities you got. So this is it. He knows what he wants in terms of, he's got a picture of where he'd like to be. He has no idea of what road would take him there. So he tries different things that he thinks will get him that bit closer.
In terms of Navalny, you mentioned Navalny there a couple of times in this interview. Obviously this is the opposition leader who was poisoned, went to Germany, came back to Russia, was immediately imprisoned for, I can't remember how many years, but I think maybe 3 years or something. Maybe longer than that, you can tell me. What will Navalny's lasting effect be, if any, on Russia, on Russian democracy? And you mentioned there you were optimistic about Russia's direction. Do you think, if not Navalny, but someone else could eventually lead Russia into a more liberal, democratic process as a country?
Yeah. I mean, In terms of Navalny himself, his long-term effect, let's be honest, none of us know. He made one hell of a gamble. I mean, after he'd been poisoned and he was medevaced out to Berlin to recover, when he went back to Russia, he had no doubts but that he was going to be arrested the moment he stepped foot back on Russian soil. And that was, I mean, astonishing act of bravery on one hand, and also an astonishing act of patriotism. Because I think he knew that he didn't want to be one more of those, Russian politicians and Russian figures who fled the country and from a safe job at a think tank or a board of directors or whatever in the West encourages Russians to rise up, knowing full well that the state will heavily-handedly repress them. No, yeah, I mean, he wanted to show that he had skin in the game himself, that he was willing to put himself on the line. And in the process, change himself from just being one more guy complaining about Putin and corruption into precisely some kind of moral leader for Russia. Now, clearly the state is effectively punishing him for that. It's not just that he's in prison, but he's basically being put under conditions that, frankly, one could consider to be almost torture, in terms of being woken up every hour because he's an escape risk and so forth. So we're going to have to wait and see. It might well be that the state will manage to basically marginalize him, or it might be that he will be the sort of the symbol of change. But in terms of the sort of big picture, when ordinary Russians are polled about what do they really want, not in terms of which leader would you like or whatever, but what do you want for your life? What do you want for your future? It's very, very few of them who say, oh, a great and glorious Russia with a massive military or whatever. No, I mean, the things they want is, a decent quality of life, a belief that their kids will have a better quality of life yet, chance to travel, chance to set up businesses without them being stolen by corrupt officials, the chance to feel you have some say in what goes on in your community, in your neighborhood. In other words, all the rights that we enjoy in the West and we frankly take for granted. I think that what we're going to see after Putin, when Putin goes, and it could be that he'll have some kind, I don't know if you can overdose from Botox, but something could happen to him tomorrow. It could be that he finds someone he feels he can trust as a successor in 5 years' time, or it could be that he'll last until, in theory, he could be president until 2034. Sorry, 2032, 2036 rather. Anyway, when he's 84. But when it comes down to it, there is going to be this generational shift. And if you look at the current kind of rich and powerful Russians who are in their 50s and early 60s, they're not committed to some kind of grand ideological crusade with the West. No, they're not Democrats either. They are pragmatic kleptocrats. They're corrupt officials and business people who basically want to make money at home, steal at home, and bank abroad. They enjoyed the early years when there was much more contact between Russia and the West. Why? Well, because they wanted to move their money to London and buy themselves exclusive penthouses, overlooking Hyde Park. They wanted to send their kids to Oxford or to Harvard. They wanted to be able to anchor their yachts in the south of France or southern Italy. They enjoyed the opportunity to do all that. And they will want to have that again. So I think what we'll see is the next generation, they're going to be corrupt officials, but they're not going to have a problem with the West. They're going to want to improve relations with the West. And they're going to want to bring in rule of law. The trouble is, at the moment, there's no real law in Russia. And what Russia is, it's on a bit of a soapbox, so stop me if I'm going on too long. But Russia is on the cusp of one of the biggest intergenerational transfers of wealth the world has ever seen. These people who became filthy, filthy rich in the 1990s, usually by filthy, filthy means, they're now beginning to get older. They're looking at how they want to be able to hand their money on to their kids and their chosen successors. And they want there to be law to allow that and guarantee that. Because they're looking at these pampered little kids and thinking, I don't want them to have to fight the way I had to fight in the 1990s when people were being blown up by car bombs and so forth. And they're probably looking at the little darlings also and thinking, and I don't think they could fight that way. So they're going to want to bring in rule of law to basically fix, once you've stolen everything, you want the law to guarantee your ownership of it. And the thing about that is rule of law is the necessary first step for democracy. So I see it, you might say, we're talking 2 generations. The next generation after Putin will be corrupt, but they will improve relations with the West because they want to be able to enjoy the fruits of the West. And they're also bringing rule of law. And then it's the generation after that where we might begin to see genuine democracy coming to Russia. So it's not going to happen quickly, but broadly speaking, I think that the trend is in the right direction.
You mentioned China previously, and people in the UK, in the US, especially with the pandemic, have seen China as more of a threat. And I think across the West, if you look at opinion polls, it's been a dramatic change in attitudes of ordinary people towards China as an economic rival, as a danger, as a threat to the West. How does this impact Putin's goals? How does this impact Russia as a power? And you talked about bandwidth. Obviously, that could mean that the West are sort of tilting towards China and ignoring Russia. So what could the impact of the rise of China have on Russia itself?
Well, it's interesting because it's short and long term. In the short term, we also get very concerned about what seems to be a strong alliance between Russia and China. And it's true that they are both kind of against what they see as the sort of Western domination of the globe and such like. However, when you look at it, actually, the Russians are also beginning to get worried about China. It seems to have been this last year in particular that China, which obviously has been kind of growing, but this has decided to get a lot more aggressive. We've had this so-called wolf warrior diplomacy of Chinese diplomats being very, very kind of critical and hostile of the host nations. China throwing its weight around. When the Australians suggested that there should be some kind of international inquiry into the origins of coronavirus, immediately Beijing putting sanctions on the Australians, that kind of thing. So, the Russians see this country with which they have a kind of a complex relationship in the past, with whom they share this very long land border. A country, China is arming at an incredibly fast rate. And the days when the Russians could take comfort in the fact that they had at least a technological edge, that's getting eroded very, very fast. I remember someone I'd known for decades who was a retired army officer who'd been in the general staff, in the sort of main think tank arm of the military. And his view was, and this was just a couple of years ago, that in 20 years' time, Russia will have had to have made a choice. Either it will be an ally of the West of some kind, or it'll be a vassal of China of some kind. In other words, that ultimately, if we don't do something, that Russia will just simply become part of China's sphere of influence, a place where they buy oil and gas and timber, but that's about it. But I think the problem is that this is a long-term challenge. And in the situation, Russia needs China. For example, there's this regular talk about one sanction that could be done against Russia is to kick it off the SWIFT system, which is the interbank transfer system. Well, if that happened, then Russia would have to depend on China's equivalent of the SWIFT system. So the trouble is, at the moment, the more pressure we put on Russia, there is the risk that it moves it towards China. But China ultimately is in many ways more scary for the Russians. Look, the Russians don't really think that NATO tanks are going to roll across the border in their direction. Not really. 10 years' time, China? Not quite so sure about that. China has a lot of population. If you look at the Russian Far East, there's a lot of resources and very few people. It will be very difficult to actually hold on to all of Russia east of the Ural Mountains if China really wanted to start pushing. So I think on the one hand, this focus on China may look as if we're giving Russia a bit of a pass. But actually, at the same time, what we want to do is make sure that we don't push Russia towards China too much. And in fact, quietly speaking, I think there are people in Moscow who, although they couldn't possibly say so, are actually quite pleased that we are now getting a lot more serious about China.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining us.
My pleasure.